whatever are the institutions in the state, whatever people are a part of the state, the powers of the state should not be concentrated in one institution or one person. They should be divided amongst separate institutions. The second aspect of constitutionalism, how government can be made less absolute, how government's power can be limited. This is called, and this is specifically mentioned in your syllabus also, separation of powers. You know, the idea is we don't want the government to be absolute. It should not have complete power. One way to check it is, one way to reduce the absolute power of the state is that whatever are the institutions in the state, whatever people are a part of the state, the powers of the state should not be concentrated in one institution or one person. They should be divided amongst separate institutions. You know, principally when you talk about the powers of the state, so primarily, you know, you can talk about three aspects. Legislative power is the power to make laws. Executive power is the power to implement laws. And then finally, of course, we have the judicial power. Right. So, this is the notion of separation of powers, that do not combine the powers of the state in one entity or one person. As you know, in the medieval ancient times, kings used to combine all these powers. King used to have the power to make laws for for his kingdom, for his territory. Then his entire bureaucracy was responsible for the civil service that worked under the kings, was responsible for executing those laws. And then when there were some judicial questions, etc., the king used to be also the head of the judicial system. In fact, something like the chief justice of the kingdom itself. So when you combine all these three powers in one entity or one person, that would lead to absolutism. So one way that has been discovered, and it's a very interesting way, and this theory has been postulated by a number of thinkers, but the person whose name is most indelibly associated with this theory is the French 18th century political thinker, whose name is Montesquieu. Probably you are familiar with this person's name. That's just about all you require to know about Montesquieu. But this is the person who, although many people have, contributed to the development of separation of powers theory, that is, the power of the state should be separated between various institutions. But this person's name is indelibly associated. It is with the development of the concept of separation of powers. And he said that if you look at the totality of states' powers, principally they can be divided into three categories only: lawmaking, law executing, and judging or judicial powers. They should be kept separate. You're getting the idea? Achha, here we are talking about what? State has a number of functions to perform. One function is making laws. Another function is implementing laws. Another function is providing justice. Getting the idea? So, this separation of powers is also sometimes referred to as there is a reason why I use the term functions over here. This separation of powers is also therefore often referred to as functional separation. Elementary, this is clear. Why am I calling it functional separation? Because principally when you talk about the powers of the state or the functions of the state also, powers are given to perform functions only. So if you talk about the principal functions of the state, they are principally these only: lawmaking function, implementing function, and judicial function. So that's why this is sometimes also referred to as functional separation. Achha, before I continue, there is also a concept called, apart from functional separation, this is called spatial separation of powers. But the focus area of our today's lecture would be basically functional separation only. But there is also a concept called spatial separation of powers. But for that, political theorists and scientists, they tend to use the expression, they prefer to use the expression distribution of powers. For example, we have a federal setup in which we have a central government, then we have state governments below it, right? Now, center has been given specific areas. If you are familiar with, details about this, I'll cover later when I come to the relevant topic. You probably are familiar with the things like union list, concurrent list, your state list, etc., which are mentioned in Schedule 7 of the Constitution. Union list very clearly says the areas in which the center can make laws. State list naturally is the area of the subjects and areas mentioned over there. States can make laws on that. And there is a concurrent joint list on which both center and state can make laws, right? So, this is this distribution of powers between the center and the state. That means center has a clearly defined sphere of action. State has its own clearly defined sphere of action. So this is often sometimes referred to as spatial separation of powers. But the more appropriate term for this would be not spatial separation, although this term appears in many books, right? It would be distribution of powers. So just to make sure, that if you read a book or an article or any kind of a write-up you read in which you come across the term spatial separation of powers, don't get confused over there. The principal idea, which the topic which is mentioned in your syllabus also, that is actually separation of powers, right? That is actually functional separation of powers only. But occasionally you will find in books that deal with separation of powers, they do tend to, draw a kind of a distinction between two types of separations. One is spatial separation, which I said the more appropriate term over here is distribution of powers between center and states, while the functional separation of powers is what we are going to discuss today, and that is also your topic, right? So now it's a very elementary thing. If there is functional separation of powers, we have to discuss this topic in detail because it's a specifically mentioned topic in your general studies 2 paper, right? No one entity, no one institution has complete power. That's the general idea. I'm repeating myself. This entity will perform one function, lawmaking. This entity will perform another function, implementing, and the judicial function would be separate from both these, and that will be performed by the judicial setup, right? And governance of the country would be done through a consensus between the three. So, just understand this. Separation of powers, once you separate the powers can still be abused. Legislative power can also be abused, executive power can also be abused, judicial power can also be abused, right? So, if executive abuses its powers, who can check it? Right, because executive is accountable to the legislature can check it. If judiciary abuses its power, so then there is a provision that the parliament can, by a special majority, remove the judges also. So, a natural corollary, a natural derivative or natural, something that flows naturally from separation of powers is the concept of checks and balances. What is checks and balance? You are responsible for legislative function. Right, executive is responsible for implementing laws, but we know this. Sometimes the executive says we need a specific type of law. So what does the executive do? It cannot just make a law on its own. It has to firstly get that law approved from the legislature, get that bill approved from the legislature before it becomes a law. Right. So if the parliament finds the bill is not appropriate, it can serve as a check on the executive and strike it down. Let us say executive introduces a bill, legislature or the parliament approves it. But yet there could be some people who might say that the bill is unconstitutional, it is illegal, it is violating the constitution. Then you can go to the judiciary, right? So till the time the three act in consensus, executive introduces a bill which it feels is required by it for carrying out its function. Some law is required by executive. Legislature finally says, gives a green signal, this law is okay. Finally, judiciary also says ki there is nothing wrong in this law can go on. So, you can see that here the running of the country, governance of the country is being managed in terms of a consensus between the three. Minus the consensus, a certain activity will not be allowed to go on. So, in this case, for example, a law will not be allowed to take effect. You're getting my point over here, na? That if you separate these powers between legislature, executive and judiciary, then each of these institutions also serve as a check on the other. Okay, legislature can make all kinds of laws, right? But if the law is unconstitutional, judiciary can strike it down. You got the idea. But if a judge is not performing properly or a judge is corrupt, legislature can remove it also, right? Then executive also has some judicial powers, like for example, after all, it is the executive, the president of India, who is responsible for appointing the right kind of judges also, right? So, the broad concept of separation of powers is clear to you now. The powers of the state, which are principally three, cannot be combined in one entity. They have to be separated. At least three powers or functions can be identified. That's why we call it functional separation. And dear, if these powers are combined in one individual, then you have an autarky, then you have an autocracy, then you have a absolutist government, then civil liberties will not be protected. In an absolute government where all these powers are concentrated in one entity or one ruler or one king or one monarch, you cannot really expect any kind of democracy also. So, the first question I naturally expect from this topic is, what are the benefits? What are the positivities of having this separation of powers based administrative arrangements, governance arrangements? So, mention the topic now. What are the benefits? Benefits of separation of powers. And we are talking about functional separation, not spatial. I indicated to you that is very different. In fact, the appropriate term over there is obviously distribution of power. Now, what are the benefits of separation of powers, functional separation of power? As I mentioned that if these powers are combined in one entity, one person, that leads to absolute rule, that leads to autocracy, rights of people will not be respected, there can't be any democracy. So, basically, one very important function that separation of powers performs is what? One, it preserves democracy and rights of the people. Because in an autocracy where one person is combining all the powers, it really depends upon him only whether rights will be respected. And when you have combined all the power into yourself, then you have no interest in democracy also. This is an absolute rule. So one thing that separation of it's only because of separation of powers that you can sustain something like a democracy and rights of people can be respected. How? If the parliament passes a law that is taking away the rights of people, which parliament is not authorized to do. They cannot take away fundamental rights, but somebody can go to the court and say that this law is violating, taking away fundamental rights, and therefore, because separation of power exists, judiciary can strike that law down, which is actually taking away the rights of the people, right? So it preserves democracy and rights of people. And secondly, you have three organs: legislature, executive, and judiciary, looking after specific areas of governmental activity. So this also promotes a healthy division of labor. Promotes specialization in these fields, development of efficiency and expertise in this field. You can mention the next point also. It promotes a healthy division of labor. And therefore, because each of these entities primarily, focusing on just one aspect of governmental functions, so they tend to acquire specialization in it, expertise in it, and if you are specialized, you become more efficient also in the delivery of those functions. And then see this. Because finally governance will have to be carried out through a consensus between the three. Take the example of a bill, as I mentioned earlier. If the executive wants some kind of a law to be put in place, it is very keen to have some kind of a law that it should be there. The executive has to first introduce a bill in the legislature, get its approval from legislature. There a lot of debate takes place. Opposition questions the executive, why do you need this bill? Or they sometimes object to certain specific provisions. They move amendments to those specific provisions also. A very healthy, a lot of friction takes place, but this is very healthy and constructive friction, right? Then finally, when the bill is passed by the legislature, becomes a law, you can again go to the judiciary, right? In the judiciary again, the judiciary will also possibly ask similar questions from a purely legal perspective then. So you see this thing, this separation of powers around governance issues provides a platform for such a healthy discussion. It creates friction, yes, but you can call it constructive friction. It provides for a constructive debate, which often leads to some better decisions. Getting the idea? When an idea is just brought about by someone, it has to be refined. And how can you refine it? By keep on questioning it, right? With questioning, you get the answers, you get answers to relevant issues which you feel are important with respect to that particular law. So it is only through this constructive friction that will exist, because there cannot be a law which will be put into place and which will be operational without consensus over here. But that consensus, before it is forged, before that there is a lot of friction that takes place between executive legislature, between legislature and executive on the one side, and the judiciary also. So finally, as a result of this deliberation, this debate, the final outcome may be actually a better one, a more refined one. So you can mention this thing. It facilitates healthy debate. You can use the word constructive friction, which often leads to a better decision, a better choice in the end. Are we getting the idea? So these are the principal benefits you can largely associate with the concept of separation of powers.